At exactly 6:15 in the morning on July 30, 1943, the engines of a B-17 Flying Fortress began to rumble to life at RAF Kimbolton in eastern England. The sky was still heavy with early dawn clouds, washed in dull grey light that gave no hint of what waited ahead. For Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, this was not just another mission, it was another roll of the dice in the deadliest air war of the Second World War. Aruth climbed through the narrow fuselage of the bomber and crawled into the extreme rear of the aircraft, settling into the tail gunner's compartment. From this position, he would be the last line of defense for the crew. If German fighters attacked from behind, as they almost always did, he would be the first to face them and the last to escape. He was 24 years old. Young by any standard, yet already hardened by experience. 12 combat missions were behind him. 3 enemy aircraft had been officially credited to his guns. Ahead lay a flight that would carry him more than 500 miles into occupied Europe and deep into Nazi Germany. Intelligence briefings that morning carried grim numbers. The Luftwaffe had massed more than 300 fighters along the planned route. The target, codenamed Castle, was heavily defended. Losses were expected. Aruth lowered himself onto a small metal seat that resembled a bicycle saddle more than a chair. This cramped compartment, barely 4 feet wide and 5 feet long, was his entire world for the next several hours. 2.50 caliber Browning machine guns protruded through a curved plexiglass enclosure, aimed permanently toward the empty sky behind the bomber. At operational altitude, nearly 25,000 feet above the Earth, the temperature outside would plunge to nearly minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The thin metal skin of the aircraft offered no insulation. Without his electrically heated flight suit, hypothermia would set in within minutes. Even with it, the cold seeped into bone and muscle, numbing fingers and slowing reaction time. Among aircrews of the 8th Air Force, the tail gunner position was spoken of in quiet, uneasy tones. Many referred to it as the loneliest assignment in the war. Unlike other gunners, the tail gunner was physically isolated, separated from the rest of the crew by nearly 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. There was no one nearby to help if the guns jammed. No one to assist if the heating system failed. No easy escape if the aircraft was hit. Just one man, 2 machine guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe decided to send. The numbers alone told the story. By mid-1943, the average B-17 crew survived barely 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners suffered fatal casualties faster than almost anyone else, second only to ball turret gunners. German fighter pilots knew exactly where to strike. They preferred attacks from the rear. The reason was simple physics. An enemy fighter approaching from behind gained the longest possible firing window. A Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf closing at high speed from the 6 o'clock position could aim and fire for nearly 10 full seconds before overshooting the bomber. In that same window, the tail gunner had to identify the target, aim, compensate for closure speed, and fire, all while the aircraft vibrated violently under engine strain and flak bursts. Many never even fired a shot. German fighters were heavily armed. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried 2 20mm cannons and additional heavy machine guns. A single well-placed burst could shatter the tail's plexiglass enclosure, kill the gunner instantly, and cripple the aircraft's flight controls. A bomber without tail protection was effectively doomed. Fighters would circle back and finish the job methodically. To counter this threat, the U.S. Army Air Forces relied on strict gunnery doctrine. Gunners were trained to conserve ammunition at all costs. They were instructed to hold fire until enemy fighters closed within 300 yards, then fire short, controlled bursts. On paper, the logic was sound. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner, instructors claimed, could make 800 rounds last an entire mission. But combat did not follow classroom logic. At 300 yards, German fighters were already firing. By the time a tail gunner squeezed the trigger, cannon shells were already ripping through aluminum and flesh. Aruth had witnessed the consequences firsthand. On an earlier mission, a B-17 flying off his right wing took a direct hit to the tail section. The German fighter attacked at high speed, firing before the American gunner could react. The first shells punched through the plexiglass enclosure. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke and fire. 8 parachutes appeared. The tail gunners did not. That moment stayed with Aruth. The Luftwaffe, he realized, understood American training better than many American commanders did. German pilots knew U.S. gunners waited. They used that hesitation as a weapon, opening fire from long range while the Americans held back, obedient to doctrine. To Aruth, it felt like following a rulebook written by someone who had never sat in a tail gunner's seat. By the summer of 1943, the 379th Bombardment Group, Aruth's unit, had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months. 90 men gone. Entire crews erased in seconds. Each loss reinforced the same grim pattern. Aruth began to question everything. That morning, as 186 B-17s lifted off from bases across eastern England, he checked his ammunition belts. 400 rounds per gun. The manual said it was enough. Aruth was no longer convinced the manual understood reality. P-47 Thunderbolts would escort the formation partway, but fuel limitations meant they would turn back over Belgium. Beyond that point, the bombers would fly alone. Aruth knew what that meant. Somewhere ahead, hundreds of German fighters were waiting. And the old rules, he believed, were getting men killed. As the bomber stream climbed higher and settled into formation, Michael Aruth remained alone in the tail of the aircraft, staring through the curved plexiglass window at the shrinking English coastline. The channel glimmered below like a sheet of dull steel. Beyond it lay occupied France, then Belgium, and finally Germany itself. The P-47 Thunderbolts flew nearby, their massive radial engines producing a reassuring presence. To many crewmen, the escort fighters symbolized safety. To Aruth, they were a reminder of a hard truth. The Thunderbolts carried fuel for barely 90 minutes of combat flight. The mission ahead would take more than 6 hours. Most of the journey would be flown without protection. Aruth thought back to his earliest missions. Like every tail gunner, he had followed the rules exactly as he was taught. Wait for the fighter to close. Aim carefully. Fire only when the target was well inside 300 yards. Conserve ammunition at all costs. The instructors at gunnery school had drilled these principles relentlessly. Ammunition was finite. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner, they insisted, could defend the bomber and still return home with rounds to spare. But the doctrine assumed the enemy would play by the same script. The Luftwaffe did not. German fighter pilots had learned American habits quickly. They knew U.S. gunners waited until the last moment. So they attacked from farther out, opening fire at distances beyond 600 yards. Cannon shells tore into bomber formations while American gunners held their triggers, watching, waiting, obeying. By the time the doctrine allowed a response, the damage was already done. Aruth began analyzing the problem from a different angle. To him, a fighter approaching from long range was not an impossible target, it was an ideal one. The aircraft flew straight toward him, nose pointed directly at his position. Its silhouette grew larger by the second. The closing speed made its apparent size double rapidly. If he fired early, he could adjust his aim as the range closed, walking his tracers onto the target. The real cost wasn't accuracy. It was ammunition. Each tail gunner carried roughly 800 rounds total. A long mission could involve 15, 20, sometimes 30 separate attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the math became brutal. Fire too often and you risk running dry before reaching home. Aruth accepted the trade-off. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made the wrong bargain. Survival depended on disrupting the enemy before the attack succeeded. If that meant risking empty belts later in the mission, so be it. Dead men had no use for reserve ammunition. His first true test came weeks earlier during a raid against submarine pens at St. Nazaire. 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s approached from low and directly behind, the textbook tail attack. Standard doctrine demanded patience. Aruth ignored it. At nearly 700 yards he opened fire. The tracers arced through the sky, falling short at first, then climbing toward the lead fighter as Aruth adjusted his aim. The German pilot saw the stream of fire rushing toward him and broke off immediately, diving away before reaching effective firing range. His wingmen followed. Neither fighter scored a hit. After landing, the crew chief confronted Aruth. The ammunition count showed nearly 200 rounds expended in a single engagement. At that rate, he would be defenseless deep inside Germany. Aruth explained his reasoning calmly. The crew chief listened, unconvinced. Word spread quickly through the squadron. Some tail gunners called the tactic reckless. Firing at such long distances violated everything they had been taught. Training manuals existed for a reason, they argued. Aruth was gambling with his crew's lives. But his bomber kept returning intact. Mission after mission, the aircraft came back to RAF Kimbolton with its crew alive. Other bombers in the squadron were not so fortunate. By mid-July, 3 aircraft had been lost. 30 men gone. On July 30th, as the formation crossed into Belgium, Aruth watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings and turn back toward England. Fuel gauges demanded retreat. The bombers pressed on alone. Somewhere ahead, more than 300 German fighters were waiting. Aruth checked his ammunition again. 800 rounds total. The manual said it was enough for a standard mission. Aruth had already decided the manual was wrong about nearly everything else. The first enemy formations appeared just before noon. Fighters climbed from the southeast in groups of 4. Then more. 8. 12. Aruth stopped counting. The sky behind the bomber filled with black crosses painted on yellow noses. The lead fighter began its attack from high and directly astern, diving toward the formation at nearly 400 miles per hour. Aruth tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow larger with each second. At extreme range, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared, sending streams of tracers across the sky. The first rounds fell short. Aruth adjusted his aim, walking the fire upward. At around 600 yards, bright flashes sparked along the enemy aircraft's engine cowling. The German pilot broke away hard, smoke trailing behind him. He never completed his firing pass. There was no time to celebrate. Another fighter closed in, this one flying lower, trying to slip beneath Aruth's field of fire. He depressed his guns to their mechanical limit and fired anyway. The German pilot flinched, pulling up early and releasing cannon shells into empty sky above the bomber. Attack followed attack. For nearly 50 minutes, German fighters slashed through the formation. Aruth fired at every aircraft that came within range, burning ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed from sustained fire. Then one fighter flew straight and level, directly behind the bomber. Whether it was bravery or poor judgment, Aruth never knew. He centered the aircraft in his gun sight and held the triggers down. The Brownings hammered continuously, pouring more than 100 rounds into the approaching fighter. The Messerschmitt came apart in midair. Engines separated. Wings folded backward. What remained tumbled past the bomber close enough for Aruth to glimpse the empty cockpit. 2 confirmed kills. His ammunition count dropped below 200 rounds. Ahead, the formation approached the target. For the bombers, the most dangerous phase of the mission was about to begin. As the bomber stream closed in on its target, the aircraft settled into straight and level flight. For the men aboard, this was the most exposed moment of the entire mission. Maneuvering was impossible. Formation discipline had to be maintained while bombardiers aligned their sights and waited for the release signal. The Luftwaffe understood this perfectly. The German fighters pressed their attacks with renewed aggression, knowing the bombers could not evade. From his position at the very rear of the aircraft, Michael Aruth watched the sky behind him fill once again with enemy silhouettes. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove in from the 5 o'clock position, closing rapidly. Aruth swung his guns to meet it, and fired a short burst. The tracers struck near the fighter's wing root. The German pilot held his course, cannon shells ripping into the bomber's tail section. Aruth felt the impacts before he felt the pain. Fragments of 20mm shells tore through the plexiglass enclosure. Shards shredded his heated flight suit and embedded themselves in his left arm and shoulder. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment, misting the air with an oily sheen. His left gun jammed instantly. The temperature inside the tail dropped as cold air rushed in through shattered panels. Aruth did not stop firing. With blood running down his arm and numbness spreading through his fingers, he kept his right hand on the remaining trigger. One-handed, wounded, he tracked the departing Focke-Wulf as it pulled away from the formation. A final burst struck the fighter's tail assembly. The aircraft snap-rolled violently, then plunged toward the ground. His third confirmed kill of the mission. The intercom crackled with voices from the crew. Reports of flak ahead. Questions about damage. Aruth tried to answer but found his throat dry and unresponsive. Blood pooled on the floor of the compartment, freezing almost immediately in the sub-zero air. He checked his ammunition. Only 63 rounds remained. 3 enemy fighters destroyed. 1 gun disabled. And the mission was only halfway complete. The formation reached the target area and began its bombing run. For 11 minutes the bombers flew straight and level, unable to maneuver while bombs were released. German fighters swarmed, knowing this was their final chance to inflict maximum damage. Despite his wounds, Aruth remained alert, scanning the sky through blood-smeared plexiglass. Any attacker that approached was met with controlled bursts. He could no longer afford long suppressive fire. Every round now had to count. When the last bombs fell, the formation finally turned westward. The return flight began at 1:04 p.m. 185 bombers turned back toward England, leaving the target burning beneath thick columns of black smoke. But the danger was far from over. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, replacing damaged aircraft with fresh ones. The second gauntlet awaited. Aruth remained at his position, his injured arm wrapped tightly in a scarf torn from his flight gear. His left gun was completely inoperable, the feed mechanism shattered by the same shell that had wounded him. He now had one working weapon and 63 rounds to cover more than 250 miles of hostile airspace. The math was unforgiving. With that ammunition, he could afford perhaps 3 short engagements. The luxury of aggressive early fire was gone. Precision had replaced suppression. At 1:31 p.m., a pair of Messerschmitts approached from the 7 o'clock position. Aruth waited until they closed to roughly 500 yards. Then he fired a 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine cowling. The aircraft rolled inverted and dove away, trailing coolant. The wingman immediately broke off without firing. 51 rounds left. As the bomber crossed back into France, the intensity of attacks slowly diminished. German fighters reached the limits of their operational range and were forced to disengage. By late afternoon, the formation finally outran the last interceptors. The English Channel appeared on the horizon like a promise. The bomber landed back at RAF Kimbolton at 3:52 p.m. Aruth could not exit the aircraft on his own. Ground crewmen pulled him from the tail compartment and carried him to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon later counted 11 separate fragment wounds across his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Within hours, word spread through the 379th Bombardment Group. The tail gunner on that aircraft had destroyed 3 enemy fighters while wounded, operating a single machine gun with barely 60 rounds of ammunition. Intelligence officers noted that his early engagement firing technique had directly contributed to the bomber's survival. Other tail gunners began asking questions. The doctrine said wait until 300 yards. Aruth had fired at 800. The doctrine said conserve ammunition. Aruth had burned through more than 700 rounds. The doctrine produced dead gunners. Aruth was still alive. Combat footage confirmed it. Gun camera film showed tracers reaching far beyond traditional engagement ranges, disrupting attack runs before German pilots could establish stable firing solutions. Forced to maneuver defensively, their accuracy collapsed. By mid-August, several other tail gunners within the group had adopted variations of Aruth's approach. Their survival rates improved. The bombers they defended returned with less damage. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. And the Luftwaffe had begun to notice something was changing. The effects of Michael Aruth's actions did not end with that single mission. Within days, intelligence officers, squadron commanders, and gunnery specialists were poring over combat reports and gun camera footage from the raid. What they saw challenged years of established assumptions. Frame by frame, the footage revealed a pattern. Enemy fighters that encountered early defensive fire rarely completed stable attack runs. Even when the tracers fell short, German pilots reacted instinctively, breaking formation, rolling away, or aborting dives before they could line up accurate cannon fire. The disruption mattered. Bombers that should have been shredded survived because attacks never fully materialized. The cost was ammunition. The benefit was survival. Other tail gunners in the 379th Bombardment Group began quietly experimenting. Some opened fire slightly earlier than doctrine allowed. Others extended their bursts by a few seconds. Not everyone was convinced. Ammunition shortages remained a real concern, especially on deep penetration missions. But the numbers began shifting. Aircraft defended by aggressive gunners returned with fewer holes in their fuselages. Crews reported fewer wounded. Losses did not vanish, but they declined. German pilots noticed as well. By early September, Luftwaffe intelligence officers began collecting debriefs from fighter units across occupied Europe. Reports described an unsettling change. American tail gunners were firing sooner, sometimes at distances exceeding 600 yards. The once reliable rear approach was becoming increasingly hazardous. Pilots complained that tracers reached them before they could stabilize their aircraft. Even when rounds missed, the psychological effect was immediate. Seeing streams of fire rushing toward them forced evasive maneuvers. Attack geometry collapsed. Accuracy suffered. The Luftwaffe responded in phases. First, they increased approach speeds. Fighters dove faster, hoping to reduce exposure time. But higher speed reduced aiming precision. Misses increased. Next, they altered attack angles, favoring steep dives from high 6 o'clock positions where gravity could assist pullouts. The tactic reduced exposure slightly, but made tracking targets more difficult during the dive. Finally, they attempted selective targeting, trying to identify bombers with particularly aggressive gunners and eliminate them early. In practice, this proved nearly impossible amid the chaos of mass air combat. None of these adaptations solved the core problem. Meanwhile, Aruth recovered in the station hospital. His wounds had narrowly missed major arteries and nerves. Pain remained constant, but movement slowly returned to his arm. Doctors cleared him for flight duty on August 19, just 3 weeks after the Castle mission. By then, his original aircraft had been written off. Damage accumulated over 17 missions had rendered it uneconomical to repair. A replacement B-17 awaited him on the flight line, carrying the same name and crew. On August 26, Aruth climbed back into the tail position. The air war had shifted. German fighter commanders were searching for answers. American bomber crews sensed a subtle change in the balance of power. The edge created by surprise and innovation was real, but temporary. Aruth understood that once the enemy adapted fully, the advantage would fade. Each mission became a test. Between late August and early September, the 379th flew 11 combat operations. Aruth participated in 4, adding 2 more confirmed kills to his record. Other tail gunners within the group claimed additional victories using similar techniques. Loss ratios climbed on the German side. In response, Luftwaffe commanders began concentrating attacks instead of spreading fighters across entire bomber streams. The idea was simple: overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers. The tactic succeeded briefly. On September 3, concentrated assaults against another bomber group destroyed 8 aircraft in just 15 minutes. Entire crews vanished before help could arrive. The 379th escaped that fate by flying in a different position within the combat box. The lesson was unmistakable. The air war over Europe had become a contest of adaptation. Every innovation triggered a countermeasure. Every success carried the seed of its own obsolescence. And the most dangerous test of all still lay ahead. The mission scheduled for September 6 targeted Stuttgart, deep in southern Germany. It would be the longest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month, more than 500 miles of hostile territory. Stuttgart was no ordinary target. The city produced ball bearings essential to nearly every German vehicle, aircraft, and weapons system. Its strategic value made it one of the most heavily defended locations in Europe. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the city. Fighter squadrons were positioned along every likely approach route. The briefing on September 5 left no room for optimism. The 379th Bombardment Group would fly in the lead position of the combat wing. Lead bombers absorbed the first fighter attacks. They flew straight and level, while others maneuvered. They carried the burden of navigation and bomb aiming for formations behind them. It was the most exposed position in the sky. That evening, Aruth inspected his guns personally. Both Brownings were freshly serviced. Feed mechanisms ran smoothly. Barrels had been replaced after exceeding safe round counts. He loaded 1,200 rounds, far more than standard issue. The extra weight mattered less than firepower. Tomorrow would determine whether his methods could withstand the most dangerous mission of his career. The morning of September 6 began like dozens before it, but the tension felt different. The briefing room at RAF Camp Bolton was unusually quiet as crews studied the maps pinned to the wall. The red line marking the route to Stuttgart stretched deep into southern Germany, farther than most men had ever flown. The target lay at the edge of American escort range. That fact alone changed everything. When the briefing officer finished, there were no questions. The men understood the risk. The lead position assigned to the 379th meant they would be the first bombers the Luftwaffe saw, and the last ones to escape. As engines roared to life on the runway, Michael Aruth climbed into the tail compartment of the B-17 that now bore the markings of WWII impact. The familiar metal enclosure felt smaller than usual. He checked his guns one final time, ran his hands along the feed chutes, and settled into position. The bomber lifted off just after sunrise. For the first 2 hours, the flight was uneventful. The formation climbed steadily, passing over the English Channel and into occupied France. P-47 Thunderbolts joined them briefly, their presence reassuring but temporary. At 10:17 a.m., the escorts peeled away. The bombers pressed on alone. Aruth watched the sky behind him carefully. Experience told him the first attacks would come soon, fast, probing strikes meant to test the formation's defenses. He adjusted his guns and steadied his breathing. The Luftwaffe arrived over the Rhine. Fighters emerged in waves, climbing from below and diving from above. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs attacked in pairs and fours, slashing through the formation with practiced precision. Tracers and cannon shells streaked past the tail of the bomber. Aruth opened fire early. His tracers reached out toward the approaching fighters, forcing them to maneuver before they could line up clean shots. One aircraft veered off sharply. Another broke formation entirely. The attacks continued, but none held steady long enough to be lethal. Then the flak began. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire blossomed around the formation as Stuttgart came into view. The bombers flew straight and level, locked into bombing formation while gunners fought to keep fighters at bay. A violent explosion rocked the aircraft. A flak shell detonated beneath the bomber's right wing, tearing through the fuselage. The aircraft lurched hard to the left. Aruth slammed against the side of the compartment as debris tore past him. The intercom erupted with shouted damage reports. Engine number 3 was on fire. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. Control cables were damaged. Despite the chaos, the bomber held formation. German fighters seized the moment. With the aircraft wounded and unable to maneuver, enemy pilots attacked relentlessly. Aruth fired continuously, his guns roaring as tracers carved bright paths through the sky. One fighter flew directly into his stream of fire and exploded in a flash of flame. Another kill. But the damage was too severe. Moments after bombs were released, engine number 3 tore free from its mounts and fell away, spinning toward the ground below. The bomber shuddered violently. Speed bled off. The formation pulled ahead, unable to slow without risking collision. The aircraft was alone. Aruth checked his ammunition. Less than 300 rounds remained. His arms ached from sustained firing, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Fighter attacks continued as the bomber limped westward, struggling to maintain altitude. Over southern Germany, the situation worsened. Engine number 4 began to fail. Oil pressure dropped rapidly. The aircraft could no longer hold altitude. The pilot's voice came through the intercom, tight and controlled. They would not make England. The crew discussed options quickly. Bailout over Germany meant capture, or worse. A controlled crash was impossible at their altitude and speed. There was only one chance. They would attempt to reach the North Sea and ditch. For more than an hour, the damaged bomber crawled westward, escorted only by its own guns. Aruth fired sparingly now, saving rounds for aircraft that pressed too close. Each burst was deliberate. Each attack repelled bought them another mile. Finally, water appeared on the horizon. As the bomber crossed the coastline, the last German fighters broke off, unwilling to follow the crippled aircraft over open sea. Silence filled the sky behind them for the first time that day. The pilot ordered the crew to prepare for ditching. Aruth secured his guns and braced himself inside the tail compartment. The bomber descended toward the dark, choppy surface of the North Sea. At 2:11 p.m., the aircraft struck the water with tremendous force. The impact tore the fuselage open. Cold water rushed inside instantly. Aruth was thrown forward as the tail section buckled. He clawed his way out through the shattered rear of the aircraft just as it began to sink. Around him, crewmen struggled in the freezing water, clinging to debris and inflatable rafts. Within minutes, the B-17 vanished beneath the waves. All 17 aircraft that had attacked them that day were gone. Hours later, British rescue vessels spotted the survivors and pulled them from the sea. Aruth collapsed on the deck, exhausted, injured but alive. The Stuttgart mission would go down as one of the most brutal raids of the year. For Michael Aruth, it marked the end of his combat tour, and the beginning of a legacy that would quietly reshape how American bombers defended themselves in the skies over Europe. Michael Aruth spent nearly 3 weeks recovering after the Stuttgart mission. Exposure to freezing seawater, shrapnel wounds, and exhaustion had taken a heavy toll on his body. Doctors initially doubted he would ever return to flight status. But the war had a way of accelerating decisions. By late September, Aruth was walking again. His combat record was quietly reviewed by intelligence officers and 8th Air Force Command staff. Confirmed victories, disrupted attacks, and most importantly, survival rates tied directly to his defensive methods were difficult to ignore. His actions had not been reckless. They had been calculated. The official reports told a different story than the training manuals. Aruth was credited with 5 confirmed aerial victories, all achieved from the tail position of a B-17, an almost unheard of accomplishment. More significant than the numbers was the influence his tactics had on others. Early engagement defensive fire was no longer dismissed as wasteful. It became a topic of serious discussion. By the end of 1943, revised gunnery guidance began circulating informally among bomber units. While doctrine never fully abandoned ammunition conservation, gunners were encouraged to prioritize attack disruption over perfect accuracy. Survive first. Count rounds later. Loss rates gradually declined. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin by mounting attrition and fuel shortages, never fully solved the problem. By 1944, long-range Allied fighter escorts changed the balance permanently. German pilots could no longer rely on predictable bomber behavior. The window that once allowed deadly rear attacks had closed out. Aruth's role in that transition remained largely uncelebrated. He never sought recognition. After completing his tour, he returned home quietly, carrying memories few could understand. Like many veterans, he spoke little of the war. The skies over Europe faded into history, replaced by civilian life, but the impact remained. Every bomber crew that survived because an enemy attack was broken early. Every gunner who fired first instead of waiting. Every aircraft that returned damaged but intact, all of them carried forward the legacy of a single decision made in a freezing tail compartment at 25,000 feet. Innovation in war rarely announces itself. Sometimes, it survives quietly, and changes everything. If you want more real World War II stories that go beyond headlines, stories about unknown airmen, battlefield decisions, and moments that reshaped history, subscribe to WWII Impact. Like the video to support deep research war documentaries. Comment below. Do you think early fire tactics saved more lives? Or risked too much? Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive.